Well, thank you very much, Al. It's good to not see everyone out there. I'd like to thank, obviously, Al, I'd like to thank Michigan DOT, Michigan State, the University of Illinois Champaign, TRB, New Rail, and Michigan Tech, especially Posse here. Posse was the one who invited me to speak today. I am the railroads representative on the executive committee of the Transportation Research Board, and Posse and I met at the last TRB annual meeting, and you know, oh how we are fond for those times where we actually could get together in person. But it was back in January, and I'd like to thank Posse for the invitation to speak today. And as I always like to say, Posse, I'm sorry you couldn't get your first or second choice as a keynote speaker today. Um, I thought I've listened to a lot of the presentations here or the discussions, and I think they've been really good and really insightful. I enjoyed Joe's discussion yesterday. I didn't realize Joe was retiring, but he had a lot of good observations on the new normal or whatever we're going to call it. And I thought that the correlation to the way the world was after 9/11 was an interesting correlation. So it was good to see him. Now, I'm one. If you know me, I've spoken in the rubber chicken circuit a lot in the past 20 years, and I love going to conferences and seeing everyone and talking to folks, over dinner and whatever. But there's one really good thing about a virtual conference like this is that I can't see any of you yawning or falling asleep or on your cell phones or leaving the conference room in the middle of my speech. So I get to imagine that all of you are on the edge of your seats. You applaud thunderously after each of my slides, and you laugh riotously at all my jokes. So that's the way I'm going to look at it. And don't tell me otherwise, Posse, if you can. So I am going to go to the next slide, Posse. I'm going to talk about a lot of things that have been talked about, but probably from a different perspective. I always, when I do these things, I always spin the wheel on subjects that people are interested in: PSR, rail ownership, automation, PTC, regulatory events, mergers, et cetera, et cetera. And I just spin the wheel and come up with the three that I think are going to be most interesting to this group. And we'll have time to ask some questions and throw the bullshit flag or do whatever you want at the end of this discussion. But let's start off with PSR. If you could go to the next slide, Posse. Thank you very much. PSR has been with us since the 90s. When Hunter Harrison wrote his first book and enumerated on this, really just in one page of that book, that laid the template for what PSR was in terms of its core principles, which you can see over on the side there: serving the customer, controlling expenses, managing assets, et cetera. Fairly simple. And it was interesting that the industry really is just adopting it now, almost, you could say, 20 years later in the United States. There's a lot of things, and your PSR panel, who I thought was excellent yesterday, pointed a lot of these things out in terms of what you see. But bigger trains, fewer yards, stable safety, et cetera, et cetera. There's a couple, though, I'd like to point out. The first one is a lot of customers view PSR as disruptive. And if you look at the way that it happened on a couple of other railroads, that is the case. There was a period of long interruption, and in fact, the STB had several hearings on this with customers and with the CSX over service quality when they went through it. I'll say the one hallmark of NS's journey on PSR, which began at the end of 2018, has really been doing this in such a way that it is invisible ultimately to the customers, and all the customers are going to see is better service. So we have done this in a way probably a little bit slower, but doesn't have the big bang service disruption that you've seen in some of the other roads. And it feels like the UP is doing it that way as well. The second thing that happens with PSR is that simply because the trains are running better, they're bigger, there's fewer of them, et cetera, there's a lot of capacity that's created on the railroad. And I think that this capacity dividend is something that's going to be very important to the next phase of PSR or post PSR or whatever you want to call it, which is growth. And I've been dealing with capacity for my entire 20 years here at Norfolk Southern. I've run every business at Norfolk Southern except for coal, and capacity has always been an issue. And when you're the head of commercial in these businesses trying to grow it, capacity was always a constraint. I feel now like with PSR, given the quality of service that the railroads collectively are providing, and given this capacity dividend that's come about, that the railroads are actually really well positioned for growth from a capacity standpoint going forward. There's some other things we got to figure out. We'll talk about those towards the end, but I think that's a nuance here that is really important when we're talking about the benefits of PSR. Next slide. This is an eye chart, and I want to just take a pause here for a second to apologize for a couple of things. First of all, I'm not going to be sending out this deck. I'm an officer, and there's a lot of rules about all this. And what I've found is that if I don't have to send out the deck, I can often talk a lot freer about things. If I have to send out the deck, it's going to be a little more vanilla. And so we've chosen not to do that with in consultation with Posse. The second thing I got to apologize for is I don't normally speak from this room, but for some reason the water department decided that today they were going to tear up the pipes in the street in front of my house where my room is, and so there's a jackhammer going off. And if you hear a jackhammer in the background, it's the water department who just picked this time to do this. Going back to this eye chart here, really PSR is a process in and of itself, but it's been measured by the goal of 60 OR. And I don't know who picked that as the number, but it's kind of the number that everybody's driving for. Although Hunter Harrison, enumerated PSR in the late 90s, CN hit it in 2004 to 67. They're the first one to get below 70. First railroad, and the first railroad to get below 60 in 2015. The CP was right behind them when Hunter Harrison took over there. Norfolk Southern got sub 70 in 2014, and now as is very public, we are driving towards a 60 OR as well. It's interesting. When I joined Norfolk Southern, we were the best operating ratio railroad in the U.S. For a long time, particularly in the 90s. And when we broke through the 80s in 2004, we were thinking we were geniuses. And we held sort of the OR crown all the way up until 2009. But after that, we started to fall behind a little bit. And we're in the process of rectifying now. But it's very interesting to think about it. And it's also interesting to think that we're in an industry, at least the class one industry, where if you're not making 40% operating margins, you are prone to be chastised by your investors, might be the best way to say it. So it's a very interesting situation to be in, but it is where the industry is headed. So I want to talk about sort of the results of PSR. And PSR in a lot of ways is about industrial engineering, right? It's about engineering out activity. And I put this slide in here because I thought it really exemplified what's behind PSR. And one of the key things that railroads do is they engineer out train miles. And this is STB data. It's very public. This is the CSX. And the reason I put them up instead of us is that they're further into their PSR journey than we are. But, if you look at when this all started in 2016, 2017, when Hunter came in and the prior management left, I mean, think about this. They've engineered out over 28% of their train miles. Now, granted, their business has gone down a little bit in that period. Their RTMs are down, low teens or something like that. But one of the reasons that RTMs go down during PSR is that people engineer out not only train miles, but they engineer out circuity, which is kind of the silent killer of of railroading, and not something that people think about a lot, but they've done a nice job of this, and we're right behind them in terms of engineering out train miles. So while you may think about things like fuel productivity getting better, fewer trains, fewer humps, fewer T&E employees, it doesn't start with that. Those are sort of outcomes of this, which is engineering out activity, whether it's handlings in the yards, whether it's train miles, et cetera, whether it's circuity. As you engineer out those, the visible assets begin to fall to the wayside. And that's what people tend to equate PSR with, is what they can see. But it's what's behind that, I think, is most important. PSR has driven better service. It's certainly driven better service on Norfolk Southern, and I think all the metrics here show that as well. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the impact of COVID. You've had several discussions about that. Most of this is pre-COVID. Next, please. It has definitely impacted employment as we've engineered out activity. The people required for that activity go down as well. Obviously, this is a two-edged sword that we could talk about. I think about my company, where when I joined the company, there was over 30,000 people when we merged with Conrail, or half of Conrail, and now we're getting to the point of we're heading towards 20,000, probably lower overall in terms of our employee count. So, a reduction of a third of our employees during this period, while handling essentially the same number of RTMs. And you can see this is not just NS, but everyone in terms of T&E employees. Next slide, please. And then non-T&E employees as well. The CSX in their latest STB numbers, they're down to probably 17 or 18,000 employees from well over 30,000 at the beginning of this century. Locomotive productivity for all the railroads has been going down. And I imagine if you're a locomotive salesman and you look at this chart, this is really the reason why locomotive sales are in the basement right now. Used sales are very good. And if you're looking for 6-axle, gently used locomotives, now's the time to do it. The reason that productivity of the locomotives looks this way is really for the simple reason that the railroads haven't had time to get these locomotives off their books. This is RTMs divided by the number of locomotives that you own or lease. And if you had locomotives that were idled, then the productivity numbers would look much better. As we go into 20 and 21, you're going to see these numbers perk up. But overall, it's been a long slog downwards in terms of locomotive productivity. That will change with PSR here in the next 24 to 36 months as locomotives get off the books. Revenue growth. Revenue growth is usually not associated with PSR, and I think that's something we'll talk about in a little bit. The Western roads have had a nice run of growth since 2006. And the reason I go back to 2006 is that was a high level mark in terms of volumes in the industry. The CN and the CP have had nice growth as well. All the railroads have grown since 2006. But since 2014, which is another high water mark, essentially you've really only seen the CN and the BN grow since then. The CN has done a nice job on not only their PSR execution, but their growth strategy. And then in terms of volume growth, only the CP and the CN have grown their volumes since 2006. Now, a lot of this is because there's bigger cars and things of that nature, but in terms of unit volume overwards, I think this is the opportunity going into this next decade for the railroads, is to really, as we get our PSR DNA squared away, is to really get into growth mode with this newfound capacity that we've created through PSR. And here's RTMs as well. So you can see that RTMs have been relatively flat. And if you look at the UP, they've been declining significantly during this period. A lot of this is mixed, as coal goes down and intermodal goes up. That's certainly one of the things that's going on here. But again, revenue growth and volume, the revenue story has been good as the railroads have taken price increases and yielded up. In terms of the actual activity, though, it's been relatively flat and down a little bit during this period. And just to finish up on PSR with NS, you know, we are committed to our PSR objectives, and our CEO has been very clear that 60 OR is our objective, and doing it in such a way that it is not disruptive to our customer base, and that's extremely important to all of us. You know, in terms of our business, we've idled 4 hump operations, converted them to flat switching. In the past year, we've reduced our forces by 6,000 alone. We've reduced our locomotive fleet by 1,000. We recently took over 700 off of our books. So you'll see those numbers change. We've reduced our CapEx by $500 million, and that's okay. I mean, we're still engineering a very safe and efficient railroad, but a lot of things where we needed a capacity for growth and things like that, we're creating that capacity. So we're okay. And overall, our service has improved significantly. In the first half of this year, we've improved our productivity, T&E productivity, by 7%. Our trains are bigger. Our fuel efficiency has improved. Our speed has improved significantly. And we've had record service and shipment performance on the railroad. And I think overall, the North American rail network is, you know, putting the COVID period aside, the North American rail network is running really well right now. We're positioned nicely, I think, for share growth as that opportunity returns. Next. These are just a little couple of odds and ends that I want to use to tee up sort of my last thoughts going into this. You know, one of the very interesting things about the rail industry is just how many people are involved in it. There are 7 Class 1s, well over $80 billion in revenue. There's over 600 short lines covering North America. I don't know what their revenue is. It's not public, but I'm hoping someday to take Chuck Baker out and buy him a beer and get the answer to it. But it's probably $5 to $8 billion in revenue for those short lines. And if you think about it, the Class 1s own about 200,000 track miles in the U.S. The short lines own about 40,000. But overall, the short lines probably have 6 to 10% of the revenue of the Class 1s overall. But they're a very, very important group for the Class 1s. You have, obviously, you have commuter lines, you have Amtrak, you have an emerging group of private passenger operations. Brightline is the only one there now. In addition to that, there's over 1,100 rail car owners. The railroads only own 14% of the rail cars in North America. TTX owns another 9%, but the rest of them are owned by non-rail car entities, which I think is pretty amazing. And of course, there's thousands of freight rail customers, easily over 10,000. So this is a broad ecosystem covering over $100 billion of revenue in the U.S. alone. So when we think about short lines, one of the things that's really interesting to us and we watch very closely is M&A activity in the short line space. M&A has been accelerating to some degree. We're sort of in the second generation of short lines where during the late 80s and 90s, a lot of these short lines were spun off by the Class 1s, and now we're seeing change in ownership happen throughout the industry. We've been seeing that over the past 20 years. And one thing that's very interesting is just getting a lot of activity is the fact that, you know, these are very valuable properties. You can see that the multiples on the EBITDA and what people are paying for these railroads has been going up. You can't see the dates down there, but the bottom, the TFM one, of course, is 2006. You know, what's interesting is you look at BNSF there, which is about a third of the way to the left. You know, they were sold for $36 billion to Warren Buffett. We all remember that back in 2009. And then think about the Wall Street Journal article we saw the other day that the KCS is valued at $21 billion, just $15 billion below the BN. The BN's the largest revenue railroad in North America, and the KCS is the smallest Class 1 one. So very interesting how railroad valuations have changed here. And we'll see whether or not this is a good or bad thing in the industry, but it's something that we, particularly in the strategic planning group, spend a lot of time looking at and making sure that even with this, there's still stability in the way that we collectively serve our customers. The final one, Pan Am Southern, is up for sale. That's public, and I think you'll seeing them add to the list here at some point in the near future as well, from what I understand. The final thing I want to just touch on and then bring it all together here is automation. It's a topic that seems to come up in just about every conversation I have. I remember in 2018, Elon Musk was rolling out his truck. or 2017, I'm sorry. And in it, one of his quotes was that Tesla trucks will be economic suicide for the railroad industry. I didn't really understand that quote, but he said it, and he's smarter and richer than I am, so I'm sure that it meant something. But I think what he was trying to say is that, electric trucks, autonomous trucks, are going to wipe out the rail industry. What I like to remind people about that, of course, is that if you took all the rail freight in the U.S. and put it on the highways, you'd probably be looking at, just back of the envelope, 125 to 175 million new truckloads on the highways. I don't know about you, but those are not highways I would want to drive on. It is a big number of trucks that would shift from a private infrastructure to a public one if modal equity shifts. But I'll leave that for Ian and Chuck Baker and everybody else to talk about. Next. What I will say, and I spent a lot of time looking at autonomous autonomous impacts to our industry, mathematically, and there's been other studies on this, Oliver Wyman and others. But what we did is we took a look at about 20 of our top lanes, and we said if trucks went autonomous in various forms, how much is their cost structure theoretically go down by? Not actually, but theoretically. And the bottom line is, depending on the lane, the truck cost in competing areas was down 25 to 50%, or 25 to 40%, I'm sorry, which is consistent with some of the other numbers you've probably seen in other studies. Ironically, if you think about that number, first of all, that doesn't mean that truck pricing is going to go down 25 to 40. It just means that their cost structure would. If their prices went down, here's another interesting thing is, the railroads are all running around with 60% operating margins. The threat to the railroads in terms of this is not so much existential in terms of losing freight, but there is a threat of margin compression. And I think this is really why the railroads need to position themselves to play in the automation game going forward as well, so that we can keep the cost gap constant between the trucks and the railroads, and that will help ensure that we continue to invest in our property. Obviously, use taxes remain constant in this scenario. If use taxes go up, and they probably would have to if you see a large change in share, that would change the equation as well. But this is kind of what the numbers look like in terms of different automation factors. In terms of timing, this is something that's going to roll out over decades. We won't wake up one day and the railroads lose 1 million intermodal loads. This is going to be kind of like I always equate this to like the interstate system, where, in the 1950s, there was 22 class ones, and their presidents were up on the top floors of their corner offices looking out, watching the interstates being built all around them and saying, someday this might affect us. We should probably do something about it. And they never did. This is kind of the same thing. We're going to sit in our not our corner offices, but we're going to sit and look out and see this happening and say, someday this might affect us. We should probably do something about it. And that's really the posture that we're taking. Next slide, please. But one thing I want to say is that a lot of people say, well, we'll just go to unmanned trains or things like that. And that'll take care of it. The fact of the matter is that really won't take care of it. If you look at labor costs as a percentage of total rail cost, it's maybe 40%. And if you look at T&E costs as a percentage of that, it's maybe 25% of that. So 10% of total cost is T&E, train and engine. Let's do that. And then let's say that the total cost of the Class 1 rail industry is $50 billion. So here you have, if you take 10% of that cost, it's $5 billion, but only 40 or 30% of the rail is being PTC'd. So then your opportunity for 1 or 0 man crews is much lower than that. So you work your way down to about a 3% cost reduction if you went to 0 or 1 man crews in a PTC environment. I'm talking theoretically, because obviously there are labor agreements and everything that at this point prohibit that, but it's a thread that we hear a lot. But what this really says is if we are going to engage in an automation strategy, and the railroads are, I don't want you to think we aren't, we really need to look at a holistic automation strategy to drive structure down, to position ourselves to compete with autonomous trucks over the next 10 to 20 years. And those include tons of things. You can see the list here that I have. The list is more expansive than that. It does include road and local train automation, but it also includes a whole bunch of other things we need to do to automate the railroads and make them and keep this cost competitive gap we have with trucks intact. One of the things that I'm particularly focused on is moving to next gen rail car technology, which is putting sensors and GPS and things like that onto all 1.6 million North American rail cars. We'll save that for a different presentation, but I think it's foundational to automating many major parts of the railroad while we're also giving the customer a better experience. You know, I think PSR has been really good for the railroads, and it's, as we go through it at NS, we're not done yet, but as we go through it, it has been good for us and our customers as well. And I think after this is all done, I think the CN is kind of showing us a path forward in terms of growth. But I think that all of the railroads, all 600 plus of us, need to work on, you know, a renewed and comprehensive focus on satisfying changing customer demands if we're going to grow. Having good service or better service than we had is important. It's foundational, but it alone will not drive growth the way that we'd like to. We've got to integrate. We've got to innovate in all parts of our product offering. The second thing is that if you think about this freight rail ecosystem, it's incredibly complex. There's 600 railroads, there's 10,000 customers, and there's 1,100 rail partners. We don't communicate very well. And I've heard this in a couple of other discussions that you've had so far. And I think this is really the opportunity, is how do we, as, you know, let's call it 12,000 independent companies, how do we stitch together, or even if it's just the railroads and the rail cars, if it's, you know, 1,700 of us, how do we integrate our services while remaining independent into a more cohesive and comprehensive offering to our customers? And I think this is something the railroads are going to need, and the car owners for that matter, are really going to need to focus on coming up. And I think next gen railcar technology is going to be one of the enablers for better integrating this ecosystem. And on automation, you know, PIA is going to get us to a cost position that is going to allow us to compete with autonomous trucks well, but is going to serve two important things. First of all, for meeting 21st century supply chain needs of our customers. And it's also going to be married with PSR of ensuring that the railroads costs with the autonomous trucks so that we can compete, regardless of what public policy and federal policy, et cetera, et cetera. It's something we've got to prepare for. And I think technology and automation is one of two pillars that gets us there. And that is, wow, I actually ended on time. That's a Christmas miracle. So with that, Posse, I'm going to open it up to you and whatever we do next. I can hear everybody applauding. It's very nice. Thank you. No, don't stand up, please. Don't stand up.
Thanks, Mike. And I've got a number of questions that have come up, and I think several have to do with the precision scheduled railroading and on-time performance for intercity passenger service. And would you care to comment on, as you had indicated, the PSR is going to position you guys for growth in the future by opening up capacity, and in the long term, in the near term, how will that impact performance on intercity passenger service on Class 1s?
Yeah, so this has been a common question, and I heard Ian address it, and I think Ian did a really nice job of articulating it from the railroad perspective in terms of setting up some sort of mechanism to agree on schedules. But one thing I want to remind everybody here is that the Class 1 railroads, even if we weren't financially penalized, we have every interest in running passenger trains on time. The better that they run on time, the better the rest of our network is going to run. There is not an incentive out there to run them. We don't go out of our way to run them off time. We have an incredible incentive to run them on time, and everybody needs to know that. In terms of capacity, you know, I think there's some services as railroads dynamics have changed and their business has changed, there's been some newfound capacity that's actually allowed new passenger services. For example, 15 years ago, Norfolk Southern would have never thought about running passenger trains from Norfolk to Petersburg to DC, right? But as our export coal business has declined, we had that capacity and we worked out a deal with the Commonwealth. And so because of the dynamics and the creation of capacity, unfortunately, because of decline in demand, we were able to accommodate new passenger services. And we agreed to run up to 6 trains a day for Virginia between Norfolk and Petersburg, connecting with the CSX. And we're having that conversation with other places. So, the capacity dividend, regardless of how it's created, does create some opportunities. But at the end of the day, one of the core principles of bringing passenger on the freight rails is, if you want to bring a passenger train, you need to bring capital along with it. And that is something that we really adhere to. I thought North Carolina did a really nice job in the Piedmont Improvement Program, where they brought upward well over $350 million to essentially double track between Charlotte and Greensboro. An incredible amount of money, but it gave them the capacity to run up to 16 passenger trains per day on that railroad. So, it's a combination of where capacity is available, adding capacity, and the simple fact that we have every incentive to run these trains on time, and we do. Most of the places where the trains are not running on time, it is a capacity problem.
Yeah. Here's a quick one. As a Class 1, what is your position on teleworking?
I think our position is evolving. If you had asked us a few months ago, so I am not going to put a marker in the ground on this, but I will tell you this, that I'm really proud of our workforce. We are essential employees. We got out there, from the early days and kept the railroads running overall. So if you think about the majority of our employees are in the field, right? Teleworking for them is really hard to do. For me, it's fine. I'm in strategic planning. How hard could that be? So I like it. But I think at the end of the day, I think for conferences like this, at the end of the day, social engagement is critical for business. And my personal opinion is that we need to get back to the business of social engagement to move business forward.
Well, a couple more on PSR. One is PSR, will that become rail's equivalent to the airline's hub and spoke of the 80s, which is now being discontinued? And a follow-up on that was BNSF Railway hasn't really subscribed to PSR. So is their senior management obvious to its benefit? Is their management obvious to its benefits if all other Class 1s believe that PSR is the way of the future?
Yeah. First of all, I prefer not to comment on the BNSF's approach, if that's okay. That's how I get fired.
Yep.
Here's what I will say, though, is that hub and spoke and PSR are not necessarily correlated. If you go to a hub and spoke model, what you're doing in a lot of cases is adding security to moves. One of the key components of PSR is engineering out activity and engineering out miles. So you see more block swapping rather than hub and spoking on this. So obviously there's hub and spoke components of it, but I don't think PSR equals hub and spoke. And in some ways it's complete opposite.
Okay. Another question, Tesla and low and zero emission trucks as well as automation. What role does alternative rail traction power source play in total life cycle costs for railroad automation?
Yeah, well, so this is not really my area of expertise. I will tell you that Norfolk Southern and the railroads in general are always thinking about this. And there's been times where we've explored, catenary. I've seen a couple of studies in certain areas on that. The FEC is looking at natural gas. We've looked at batteries. Norfolk Southern's done a lot of work on battery locomotives. You may see more work on that. So the railroads are experimenting, but one thing that's true is we're incredibly fuel efficient. That's good for the environment. It's good for us, and we are getting more fuel efficient. So the economics of a competing fuel need to be compelling if we're going to make the shift. My personal view, just from what I've read, is that maybe the next step for us and maybe the world is hydrogen. fuel cells. In my view, that might be the place we ultimately end up in the next 10 or 20 years, but the economics really have to be compelling to outweigh the fuel efficiency of what we have today. I can assure you we were not going to go back to coal.
Freight rail operations in the U.S. have really developed based on experiment and adjust principle over time. You've mentioned about the need for independent research. Can you comment that is there any specific areas where you think it's needed?
That is a great question. And on my role in the TRB, I think about this a lot, and I wish I had a really good answer, but last year I started engaging a lot more with the rail subcommittee as I started with the board. And this is something that I really do want to answer. The TRB is kind of set up to do more passenger and highway kind of things than it is railroad. But I think there's got to be areas where we could do more to do more research. I need to put my thinking cap on that, but I appreciate that thought. It's a very good point.
Mm-hmm. The freight rail ecosystem is part of a larger end-to-end supply chain. How can customer experiences be helped through automation and multimodal integration go beyond being a railroad or even a transport company?
Yeah, so a great question, and I've heard this come up in a couple of other discussions here. I think you have to divide freight rail transportation into really two components. The first one is intermodal and then non-intermodal. Now, in the intermodal world, I got to tell you, the guys like Hub, UPS, those guys, they do an excellent job of providing end-to-end visibility, where the rail move is just one component of that end-to-end move, right? So they've kind of shown us the way to take multiple components of the transportation and stitch it in together into a cohesive product to the customer base. And I think this really is the model we need to look at. There aren't many moves left in the United States in the non-intermodal world where there's not at least two railroads involved, whether it's a short line or two class ones or whatever. And anytime you have that handoff, visibility can become opaque. I think Chuck Baker or Ian or somebody mentioned that providing much more comprehensive visibility is the first step. I believe that's true, and that's why Norfolk Southern is leading an effort to launch a platform for next-gen railcar technology for sensors and GPS and things like that. And because I think that is foundational. That type of visibility, real-time visibility, is foundational to bringing that ecosystem closer together.
Mm-hmm. Here's a safe one at a rail conference. The rail industry seems to be going in the opposite direction of the long-term needs of the country. Efficient transportation is a key resource for economic activity, and highway freight operations are higher cost, increasing congestion, damaging infrastructure. How can truck traffic come closer to paying full portions of the infrastructure cost and rail share of freight traffic be substantially increased over a period of years? Could onboard truck tolling be implemented using the hours of service equipment and communications? Yeah.
Okay. So that's either a softball or a hardball, but this gets down to the whole notion of modal equity, right? Which is, and this gets to sort of federal policy, which is, do you want more or less of one mode or another, right? And that's what we call modal equity. And Ian and Chuck spend a lot of their time trying to ensure that modal equity is out there. If that modal equity is going to change, it's going to change because of public policy, which is theoretically reflecting the will of the public. So, and we're not going to do much about that. I will say this: we are a compelling mode of transportation. We move 35 or 40% of the ton miles in the United States, and call it 10% of the revenue, right? 10 or 12% of the revenue. That's an important factoid there. So we've done our part in that regard. But I do think, and I go back to my last slide here, I think that it's incumbent upon the railroads right now to make their product more compelling, to bring more freight to the rail, onto the rails. We have the cost structure, we have the service. Now we just need to put on more what I'll call service focused features to bring incremental freight to the rail industry. And I think that's what the railroads, the CN kind of showing us the way, but I think that's what you're going to see from the railroads over the next decade, is trying to make their product more compelling, regardless of what the public policy on modal equity is.
What has NS done to change its risk management practice and process to minimize impact of future COVID style or other massive disruptions?
Wow. I am not going to be the expert to do that, other than we are like most companies. We followed the CDC guidelines, and we came up with what we thought were a lot of really best practices in this. There's some things you're just not going to be able to overcome. I feel like if something like COVID happened again, the rail industry will continue to be well positioned to operate in that. The real question for us, and I was listening to Joe yesterday, is that, regardless of what we do, is transportation demand going to be there? What did he say? There's how many people are riding trains now? Freight went down 20%, according to Ian. It's still down. So the big issue really is not how we're going to operate in these environments. The real question is there going to be any demand for our services? And by the way, the demand for our services is improving now. We are definitely seeing a strengthening in the freight markets.
Great. Do you see any fundamental restructuring of the NS route structure as a result of PSR, or does the company see infrastructure with presently less intensive use as a result of PSR as opportunities for future growth?
Well, here's what I will say about that is it's always one of the questions we get, and my job is every day we look at our route structure, how many track miles we have, where we go, lines that are gaining business, lines that are losing business, and we're constantly assessing what we want our route structure to look like. I will tell you this, I'm going to go back to when the CSX started doing PSR, and they announced 8,000 miles of possible short line sales, which was really odd because as railroads adopt PSR, getting rid of lines is not really a tenet of PSR. And Hunter used to say, why would I want to give it up? I can operate it better than they can. And that was his mantra. And we saw that with CN and CP. You saw very few lines. But even the CSX sort of backed off of that. They've sold a couple lines or put a couple lines up for sale, the Panhandle, Messina line, a couple of other things, but they seem to have backed off. There's going to be a little activity around the fringe, but I don't think PSR, I don't see line rationalization as a component of PSR. In fact, it has actually been the opposite in terms of what we've seen in experience. How was that for a non-answer?
Here's a technology question. Does the next generation car technology include handbrake technical change to make it easier to set out and pick up cars?
Yeah, see, that's a really good question. The technology we're envisioning doesn't do that necessarily, but I do think that having the sensors available to let people know remotely if the handbrake is on or off is really important. Mm-hmm. Rather than having to check them, because we all know that's a very timely or a very time-consuming effort. Mm-hmm. But I think there's some cool things you could do with that. Absolutely.
And this looks like the last question, at least at this point. What incentives would NS look for if it were to run more passenger service?
I'd prefer not to answer that question. Here's what I'll say about passenger possibilities is that all of them come into my department. We look at all of them, and usually the answer is no, but we will always look at them in a neutral manner. And it's going to be, do we have the capacity? Is there a revenue generation source for us? Does it increase our risk? And what kind of capacity is going to come along with it? So it's hard to meet those hurdles, but I applaud some states like Virginia, North Carolina, Michigan, and other states that have had a comprehensive approach to passenger strategy. And quite frankly, those are the conversations we'd prefer to have, are people who have a comprehensive strategy and have significant funding behind them.
Well, Mike, we really appreciate you sharing with us today and being forthright in your answers. And And thank you very much for just
Good. Well, I will imagine there's thunderous applause right now
There is.
going on.
Absolutely, they're going all over the place.
And
You know, I will take the advantage of the fact that I can actually speak, and I'm gonna pose you one more question because I can't type questions to the Q&A, so I'm gonna ask here verbally. So we are obviously in the academia. We train and teach the next generation of hopefully railroaders and people who are involved in the industry. And it's still the reality that railroads are considered, I would say, in a larger scale as the old-fashioned industry than one of these, more hype industry. What do we need to do to change that perception? Because I think for us, at least, it's very critical. That's how we sell ourselves to the future generations.
yeah, isn't that's a great question. I think about, the trucking industry, which was equally unsexy till about the past 5 or 7 years ago. And now they're talking about automation. They're talking about different fuel sources. They're talking about, all sorts of, and then you think about the amount of private equity that's gone into highway logistics, load matching, and all that kind of stuff. It's a pretty exciting space. Intermodal's played in that a little bit. The railroads really haven't. And I think, quite frankly, I'm going to go back to this thing about, integrating this ecosystem, I think presents some really interesting opportunities. The railroads at the end of the day have to allow them to happen or to make them happen. But I think that's really where the opportunity to make our industry a little sexier is going to come from.